Malachi chapter 1. Malachi chapter 1. We'll begin reading here verse 1. It says, "The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, saith the Lord. Yet ye say, Wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, We are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, They shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. And your eyes shall see, and you shall say, The Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel. A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? If then I be a master, where is my fear, saith the Lord of hosts unto you? O priests that despise my name. And you say, Wherein have we despised thy name? You offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and you say, Wherein have we polluted thee? And that you say, The table of the Lord is contemptible. If you offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And if you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now to thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? And now I pray you, beseech God, that he will be gracious unto us. This hath been by your means. Will he regard your persons, saith the Lord of hosts? Who is there among you that would shut the doors for naught? Neither do you kindle fire on mine altar for naught. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts. Neither will I accept an offering at your hand. For from the rising of the sun even to the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering for my name shall be great among the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts. But ye have profaned it, in that ye say, The table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even as meat, is contemptible. You said also, Behold, what a weariness is it! And ye have snuffed at it, and saith the Lord of hosts, Ye have brought that which was torn, and the lame, and the sick. Thus ye have brought an offering. Should I accept this of your hands, saith the Lord? But cursed be the deceiver, which hath in his flock a male, and voweth and sacrifices unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen." And so what we have here, I mentioned last week, Malachi kind of stands alone, a little bit unique as a prophet, given the time period in which he's writing. And not only the time period in which he's writing, but obviously he stands alone as the last writing prophet of the Old Testament. And so this is the standing legacy of Israel before we get into the time of Christ. And so through the prophets over the years, God had promised to Israel a great time of a blessing and restoration, a time where God's favor would be upon them in a way that it had really never been before. And yet, from the perspective of the Israelites, right now, they were living under Gentile control. I mean, that was true, but from the perspective of Israel, they're thinking, well, where is this time of blessing? You've promised us restoration. You've promised us blessing. You've promised us all these wonderful things, and it just doesn't really seem like, we're living in that wonderful of a time. And so even though God had told them about his love, and even though he had proved it 1,000 times over, they were beginning to question if God really loved them. And so this is why I mentioned last week, we were really in a state of spiritual apathy towards God. It's not so much that they despised God, although they did, we'll see that through their actions they kind of proved that. But if you ask somebody, they wouldn't say, oh, no, we hate Yahweh. No, we still love Yahweh, but it was to the point where they kind of begin to question, we're not sure about all this. Maybe he's promised all these things, but maybe they're not really going to come to pass. And so they're really in this odd state, spiritually speaking. But as I thought about that, I kind of think, how many people today ask the same questions? That we ask the same thing when we consider our difficulties, our trials, our tribulations to be unfair. Right? God, how could you let this happen to me? I mean, this is exactly what the Israelites were asking. How could you let this happen to me? But to do so, it needs to be noted that to do that proves that they were either not thinking about or not caring about the fact that fair would mean condemnation. You and I do not want what's fair from God, because what's fair from God is not what you and I would consider fair, right? And so we don't want fairness from God. No, we want grace from God. And so, if you ever get yourself into that situation where you're thinking, well, God, how could this happen to me? That's not the question you should be asking. The question you should be asking is, how could you ever bestow grace on someone like me? And so we've got to get our mind in the right perspective. And so Israel was thinking negatively about all this, right? They're really in a bad spot, spiritually speaking. And so, to prove his love for them, he brings up Jacob and Esau. And what is admittedly, and I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, a controversial section of Scripture, not only here, but when it's quoted again in Romans, I think it's Romans 9, but it's controversial in both sections. And so to prove this, he speaks of Jacob and Esau. He speaks of these boys. And so Esau, the firstborn, should have received, according to that culture and that time, he should have received the greater blessing. Being the firstborn, and not only firstborn, but firstborn son, he naturally would have received the greater blessing. He would have received the inheritance. He would have received the birthright, all of these things. That all should have gone to Esau. However, God gave that to Jacob, and what he gave to Esau eventually turned into a wasteland. And so furthermore, when his descendants, and so the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. And so when his descendants tried to rebuild, God would destroy it again, to the point that the people would call it the border of wickedness. And so what is mentioned here is what God did to Esau. Now the insinuation then is to compare it to what God did for Jacob. And so whereas the text doesn't say this, what the Israelites would have understood, and what the insinuation is that on the other hand, Jacob received a land flowing with milk and honey. Right? He wasn't the firstborn. He didn't deserve the inheritance. The birthright shouldn't have gone to him. But all of that considered, God chose Jacob, and to Jacob he received, his descendants that is, received a land flowing with milk and honey. And when the people saw how God blesses Israel and curses the Edomites, who again, in their naturalistic standpoint and their perspective, they should have received all of these blessings, they would say, the Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel. And so here's God is essentially saying, how can you make the claim that I don't love you when for your entire history I have proven time and time again that it is you whom I have chosen. It is you whom I have bestowed my favor upon. It wasn't Esau. It wasn't Ishmael. It was through Isaac. It wasn't through Esau. It was through Jacob, right? He's constantly subverting expectations to bring it down to the people of Israel. Now, as I mentioned, obviously, this is a controversial thing because he says in verse 2, he says, I have loved you, saith the Lord. But you say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was it not Esau, Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Esau, or Jacob, and I hated Esau. And so this love-hate language that God uses here caused some consternation with some. But when you read of, and this is something I've said in the past, and I stand by this, when you go back into the book of Genesis and you read the story of Jacob and Esau, when you read about Esau himself, not his descendants, but Esau, God blessed Esau. Esau had a lot of what you might call worldly success. God tremendously blessed Esau. And the fact that God is saying here that he hated Esau and he loved Jacob does not mean love and hate in our perspective of how we might think about it. What he's talking about there is essentially in the sense that he chose Jacob for the inheritance. He chose Jacob to be the means through which God's people would come, and he didn't choose Esau. And so, I've said this in the past, I would not be shocked at all to one day get to heaven and find Esau there. I just don't see anything in Scripture that tells us that Esau was this wicked, reviled, degenerate, paganistic being. And in fact, there's far more worse things said about Jacob than there is said about Esau. And so, when we talk about hate and love, why is he hated? He's hated because he didn't receive that which, again, in that day and in that time, in that culture, he would have received. And so God's hate for Esau had to do with his choosing of Jacob instead of the firstborn for the blessing of becoming God's chosen people. And so again, just like I mentioned earlier, your perspective is wrong if this is where your problem is. And so if your problem is that God hated Jacob, what you ought to be understanding is the problem ought to be that God loved Jacob. Right? If we truly understand the depravity of humanity, if we truly understand that you and I break constantly the law of God, that we are deserving of the punishment of God, it would not surprise us to see that God hated Esau. It would surprise us to see that God loved Jacob. This is brought out, and there's various people who have said kind of the same thing, but Warren Wiersbe, he was writing about a question that somebody asked to a man named Dr. Arno Gaebelin about this passage specifically. And they asked Dr. Arno Gaebelin, Warren Wiersbe is writing this, they say, I have a serious problem with Malachi 1:3, where God says, Esau I have hated. Dr. Gaebelin replied, I have a greater problem with Malachi 1:2, where God says, Jacob I have loved. Right? And so again, it's that understanding that perspective. And just from a human really standpoint, again, go back and read the story in Genesis of Esau and Jacob, particularly Jacob. Jacob's not a Bible character that's just one of those easy to love people. You go back, yeah, Beth is smiling at me. She talks about this all the time. Jacob is constantly doing things that you think, why in the world is he doing that? Right? And the reason why it should surprise us that God chooses him is specifically because of all these things. And yet still, God's purposes would be fulfilled. And God's purpose was that the nation would come through Jacob and not Esau. And that just was to prove God's sovereignty. And so, again, this isn't a salvific hatred or a salvific love. This was a hate and a love that was for the purposes of national Israel. Right? And this isn't what we're talking about, but I think that that carries on when you get into the Romans passage. I think the same thing is happening over there, but that's a whole other topic. And so let's move on to verse 6. He says, a son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? If I be a master, where is my fear? And so now he switches to specifically talk about the priesthood and the problems that were existing amongst the priests of Israel. And this is obviously a significant issue because anytime you get the religious leaders who are not only apathetic, but being downright deceptive, as we'll see in just a little bit, you can imagine that if the people who are supposed to be the closest to God are the farthest from God, what is that going to say about the people down the line whom they are supposed to be teaching? Right? Because that was one of the jobs of the priests. One of the jobs of the priests is that they were to teach the covenant to the nation. Right, that was one of the things that they were supposed to be doing. And so if you have a corrupt priesthood, what is that going to say about the people whom everything that they're being taught from God are being taught by a corrupt priesthood? Right? And so this isn't leading your nation into a good spiritual state. And so the priesthood here is very, apathetic is probably too weak a word. And so here again, and this is a concept that really is used throughout Malachi, but God gives a statement and then a challenge. And so the statement is, a son honors his father, his servant his master. The challenge is, if I'm a father, where's my honor? If I'm a master, where's my fear? Why are you not treating me, acting towards me, in the way that is appropriate, giving our relationship, giving my position as God over you? Why you're not giving me the honor, the fear that is due my name? And so God sees the priesthood as having perpetrated this attitude, but when they're challenged by this of God, they say, well, how have we done this? How have we despised your name? We're not doing that, right? They're just obstinate. They're prideful. They're arrogant to say that, no, God, you're wrong. I'm not wrong. You're wrong on this, right? This is utter arrogance. And so God says, okay, well, let's prove this. He says, first of all, here's what you're saying. You say the table of the Lord is contemptible. You say that the whole sacrificial system is something that's not even worth doing. And so your worship is poor, to put it lightly. And so they prove they didn't really care about God. They prove they didn't really care about the means of worship and the way that they acted in their worship. Again, you call the Lord's table contemptible. You offer the blind. You offer the lame. You offer the sick. You offer that which is ceremoniously unclean. And so he asks a very potent question there in verse number 8. He says, offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee? So what he's saying is, you're offering animals in worship to me as your God that you would not even dare offer to the governor should he come to your table for dinner. You would offer him something far greater than what you're trying to give to me. And so you're giving better things to your governor than you would be giving to a holy, omnipotent God. Right? And so how can you possibly sit there and ask, how have we despised your name? You have despised my name because you're treating me lower than the Persian appointed governor of Israel. And so this is, again, this shows the apathetic nature of the religious leaders, of those who are supposed to be teaching the people of Israel. And so God then in verses 9 and 10, he kind of gives some ironic and sarcastic answers here. He says in verse 9, he says, "And I pray you, beseech God that he will be gracious unto us." And then he says, "This hath been by your means. Will he regard your persons? Who is there among you that would shut the doors for naught? Neither do you kindle fire on mine altar for naught. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts. Neither will I accept an offering at your hand." And so he ironically tells them to pray for his grace, and then immediately tells them that he would not even hear their prayers. Right? And so because of what they're doing, because of this has been by your means, there in verse number 9. And then essentially the priesthood, here's what was taking place. The priesthood wanted God's favor, but they wanted nothing to do with the proper means of worshiping that God. Right? God, we want all the things that you've promised us, but we don't want to do anything in return. Right? We want to act sinful. We want to bring in all these other means of worship. We want to go off and, as we'll see later in the book, we want to go off and worship these other gods. But we would sure appreciate it if you kept your end of the bargain, right? We want your grace, we want your favor, but we don't want to do what you've called us to do. And so verse 10, again, God speaking ironically says by saying that they should just shut the doors of the temple, they should just stop the fire. He says, "Because I have no pleasure in you, neither will I accept an offering at your hand." And so it's to the point where God's saying, you might as well stop giving the sacrifices. You might as well stop. Now, I don't believe that he goes so far to tell them to stop, because I don't believe that God was going to command them to break the covenant. Okay, so in my opinion, this is God speaking ironically here. And so he's saying you might as well just stop, because of the attitude, the heart behind it is so far from what it's supposed to be. You may be bringing a sacrifice, but you're sinning the whole way. And so this is where they had gotten with their worship. And then from verse 11, he says, "For from the rising of the sun even to the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles." And so here he kind of gives a comparison, and he does this a couple of times, even at the very end of verse 14. He says, "I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen." What is he saying? I will have a reputation that is greater amongst the people who don't even worship me than it is against my own people who bear my name. Right? My name is greater there than it is here. I'm more revered there than I am here. And so God is showing just how inappropriate it was for Israel's priests to act in this particular manner. And so when he says in verse 11, he says for from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, my name shall be greater among the Gentiles, and every place incense shall be offered unto my name. There's some people who, as I was studying through this, they're thinking, well, this seems to be that God is indicating that there's going to be some form of pagan worship amongst the Gentiles, but that he would accept it because they're doing worship to Yahweh, but in a paganistic sense. And so when he says, every place incense shall be offered unto my name, that's not the way that incense was supposed to be offered according to the law. And so I don't think that what this is talking about is God accepting pagan worship. That's kind of an oxymoron. That doesn't even make sense. And so I believe what it's talking about is this is taking place in a millennial sense, where everybody is saved, everybody is offering this in the proper manner. But not only did the priest profane his name, but they also found his means of worship, again, contemptible. Right, verse 12, "But you have profaned it, and that you say the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. You said also, behold, what a weariness is it, and you have snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts." And so the very system in which they were over, being the priest, they say, what weariness is it? They're snuffing it. Again, they find this worship contemptible. We hate worshiping this God. I mean, this is essentially what it got down to. We hate worshiping this God. And then they went farther, and as I mentioned earlier, they even tried to deceive God. They say there, verse 14, "But cursed be the deceiver, which hath in his flock a male, and voweth, and sacrificeth unto the Lord a corrupt thing." And so somebody made some kind of vow to God and said, "I will bring the greatest male in my flock," and yet when it came time to actually do the sacrifice, well, hold on, I don't really want to sacrifice that male over there. That's a moneymaker. I'd rather, take this one. This one's weak, lame, blind, whatever the case. I'm not going to make any money off this one. I'll give that to God. right? Let's say this, there's a lot of applications that could be made from that. How often do we decide to give to God, but at the last minute kind of think, you know what, I'll give, but I'm not going to give my best. I'm not going to give Him all my time. I'll give Him what little bit of free time I have. You know, I'll dedicate a little bit over here, but I'm not going to dedicate all my effort over here. You know, whatever the case may be. You know, and what we've done is then we've made ourselves feel good because at the end of the day, I brought a sacrifice. Right? But what did we really bring? Did it really cost us anything? It's like David said, I'm not going to give to God that which cost me nothing. And again, I have to keep emphasizing this. This isn't just the average Joe in the street. These are the priests. These are the ones leading the nation in what was supposed to be right worship. And yet this is the kind of thing that they're doing. And so again, this is the priesthood. These are those set apart for holiness. And yet as they act, they God were nothing more than a waste of their time. That's what they're acting like. It was God who put them in the position that they're in, and yet they say, this is just simply a waste of my time. The whole world would one day fear His name, but they could not be bothered to care about the God who'd saved them, about the God who'd redeemed them, about the God who'd brought them through, the God who'd saved them time and time again. They just didn't care. And so how dreadful to think that we could ever get to the point where God's love is despised and we are bothered to obey His holy commandments. And I didn't put this in here, and I really should. I thought about this a second ago. But 1 John 5, verse 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there, John says that, you know, that His children love His commandments and they are not grievous. We love to keep His commandments and they're not grievous to us. It's not just that we're willing. Catch this. It's not that we're just willing to keep His commandments. No, we desire to keep His commandments because we love Him, because we understand what He did to sacrifice for our salvation. And so we have a love and a desire to keep His commandments, and they're not grievous to us. We don't go kicking and screaming and hating every second of the fact that, I got to do something God wants me to do today. No, it's a joyful thing. Colossians chapter 3 says, and whatsoever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. Right? Over and over. What are you doing? You're doing it for the Lord. Right? And whatever thing it may be, anything you give to God, and whatever means of ministry or means of service it is, you're not doing it for me, you're not doing it for any other person, you're doing it for the Lord. And if we truly understand that we're doing it for the Lord, it ought to change, I believe, the way we're doing it. We ought to do it, as he says, heartily. We ought to do it wholeheartedly. We ought to do it with love. We ought to do it with joy in our heart, because we understand at the end of the day, again, it's not for humans. It's not for other people that we do this. They might receive benefit from it, but at the end of the day, we're doing it because it was God who saved us. It was God who brought us up out of the muck and the mire. It was God who sent His Son to die for us, and that is whom we serve. Not man, not anybody here tonight, but Him. And one day we'll stand before Him face to face and give account of all the things that we have done. And it ought to stir us to a service that we might not have if we don't have that perspective. And then I'll close tonight with a couple of verses here from Hebrews chapter 12. Just the first 3 verses of Hebrews 12. And keep in mind, this is following Hebrews 11, talking about all these various Old Testament saints and the faith that they had. And so chapter 12, verse 1 starts by saying, wherefore, seeing we are also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, that's talking about chapter 11, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider Him that endured such contradiction of sinners against Himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. And so this is exactly what Israel's priesthood was doing. They could not care less about what God had done for them. All they could care about at the end of the day was, am I being inconvenienced by what God has asked me to do? And if I'm being inconvenienced, well, then I just don't really want to do it. And if I'm going to do it, I'm certainly not going to do it to the highest degree. Right? And so here, what is the author of Hebrews telling us? if we should ever get into that mindset, we're being bogged down. God, it seems like you're asking too much of me. Consider what he asked of his Son. And consider the joy with which Christ endured all that God laid upon his shoulders. And I guarantee you this. I guarantee you that if we approach whatever issue, whatever problem we're facing with that perspective, our troubles will seem much smaller. And if we simply say, I'm going to do it for the joy of the Lord, God will bless. God will bless that attitude. God will bless that effort. And so, like I said, Israel was in a unique, not a good unique, but a bad unique position, spiritually speaking, especially considering the fact that they had just, well, not just, but fairly recently been brought out of captivity for some of the same sins that they were currently committing. And so we're left with this prophetic word of, I'm contemptible to you. And so this, again, like I'm saying, that's not a good place for Israel to be left for 400 years before you get John the Baptist coming on the scene. Okay.